Okay, let's unpack this. Usually, when we look at national development data for these deep dives, we expect a relatively, straightforward narrative.
Right, a clean trajectory.
Yeah, exactly. It's supposed to read like a standard corporate balance sheet or just a predictable historical timeline. You naturally expect that more national wealth generally equals, well, better health outcomes across the board.
Sure, that's the standard assumption.
And you assume that higher levels of education naturally lead to more equality and, greater economic participation. And perhaps most universally, we assume that economic industrialization goes hand in hand with human progress, even if it leaves a bit of an environmental mess behind. It's supposed to be somewhat predictable.
It is. That is the familiar historical track we've all been taught to expect. As analysts, and I mean, even just as observers of global news, we like our data to be clean. We want it to show a logical chain of cause and effect. A society invests in X and therefore reaps the reward of Y.
But then you step into the world of the United Nations Development Programme's 2023-2024 Human Development Report, and you start looking at the specific data for Algeria, and suddenly that predictable balance sheet looks like it was written in two entirely different, basically contradictory languages.
Yeah, it truly is a masterclass in macroeconomic contradictions. I mean, if you are looking for diagnostic muddy waters, you have absolutely found them here.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are looking at Algeria through the lens of the latest UNDP metrics. We are trying to understand a society that is radically overperforming the global average in some areas, while simultaneously seemingly holding itself back in others.
And it's a fascinating case study.
It really is. And why should you care about this if you don't live in North Africa? Because Algeria is currently acting as a real-time laboratory for a question that, frankly, the entire world is facing right now. Can you educate your population and raise your standard of living without destroying the planet?
Right, the ultimate 21st century question.
Exactly. And on the flip side, what happens to your economy if you leave half of your absolute best talent just sitting on the bench? So, to start us off, I want to frame this for you with a massive visual contradiction. I want you to literally picture this in your mind. A stark white background, right?
Yeah.
And on it, two giant numbers connected by a thick upward pointing arrow. On the left, the number 101. According to the Standard Human Development Index, Algeria ranks 101st globally.
Which puts them roughly in the middle of the pack internationally. Not bad, not amazing, just solidly middle.
Right. But when the United Nations deducts the ecological footprint, meaning they adjust the score based on the pressure a country puts on the Earth's ability to breathe and regenerate, that number 101 vanishes. Algeria rockets up 38 spots, following that thick arrow, to land at the number 63. 63rd in the world. I've been calling this the ecological premium.
It's a staggering leap. I mean, a jump of 38 spots on a global index is practically unheard of unless a country, I don't know, discovers a massive new resource or undergoes a radical revolution. It perfectly encapsulates the central paradox we are looking at today. It makes them a green champion on paper. They are achieving a relatively high standard of living without forcing the planet to pick up the tab.
But, and this is a huge but, this green champion harbors another, much darker imbalance. When you pivot from the environmental data to the gender data, the wheels just completely seem to fall off the narrative.
Oh, absolutely. The whiplash is real.
Yeah, because the expected years of schooling for Algerian women actually dwarf global averages. They're highly, highly educated. Yet, despite this massive educational advantage, their female labor force participation rate is barely 1/3 of the global norm.
Which is the core tension we have to resolve today. How does a country perform so incredibly well for the planet's health while leaving so much of its own human potential just locked away?
Exactly. So before we can really understand the breaks in the system, we have to look at the engine itself. We need to know exactly where Algeria currently stands on the world stage without any of those fancy planetary adjustments. Let's talk about the raw Human Development Index, the HDI. In 2023, Algeria's HDI sits at 0.763.
Right.
Now, isolated, that number doesn't mean much to anyone outside of a UN statistics office, but let's compare it to the world average, which is 0.756. Algeria is officially punching above the global mean. They are officially categorized as a country with high human development.
And what is crucial here is not just that current snapshot, but the historical journey it took to get there. Because the HDI isn't just a static score, right? It's a measure of momentum. If you trace their trajectory back to 1990, Algeria's HDI was 0.595.
Wow, so that's a massive climb.
It is. Over the last 3+ decades, through global recessions, massive shifts in the oil market, intense regional instabilities, their progress has been a steady, relentless upward climb. If you picture a line chart, their blue line has consistently stayed above the gray dotted line of the global average for a very long time. It is a story of undeniable, sustained macro progress.
But I want to pull back the curtain on that 0.763 number. Because the HDI isn't just a magic number pulled out of thin air. It was actually designed to push back against the old idea that GDP, just raw money, was the only way to measure a country's success.
Right, the old purely economic lens.
Yeah. The HDI is built on specific pillars: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living. Let's break down the life and knowledge pillars because that is where the Algerian data really starts pop. First, health. The life expectancy at birth in Algeria is 76.3 years.
Which is fantastic.
It is. That is significantly higher than the global average of 73.4 years. They are giving their citizens, on average, nearly 3 extra years of life compared to the rest of the planet.
And that is a monumental achievement. I mean, you don't get a national life expectancy approaching the late 70s without getting the basic survival metrics right on a massive scale. It points to a really robust foundational healthcare system, widespread infant vaccination programs, aggressive maternal care, and general public health infrastructure like clean water and sanitation.
Right. It's not just a few rich people living to 90.
Exactly. Adding 3 full years to a national average requires saving millions of lives at the margins. It's a systemic success.
Okay, so the health pillar is really solid, but then there's the education foundation, and this is where I really started squinting at the spreadsheet. The expected years of schooling for a child entering the system in Algeria today is 15.5 years.
Which is incredibly high.
Yeah, compare that to the global average of 13.0 years. A child in Algeria is expected to stay in the educational system for 2.5 years longer than the average child globally. That sounds incredible.
It does, but we have to do some vital nuance here. Because the data provides a second, very telling metric, which is the mean years of schooling.
Okay, what's the difference there?
So mean years of schooling measures what the adult population actually has right now in their heads, as opposed to what a child entering the system today is expected to get. And the mean years of schooling in Algeria is only 7.4 years.
Wait, I have a really hard time digesting that. I need to push back here for a second. That is an enormous gap. You're saying the expectation is 15.5 years, which implies nearly finishing a university degree, but the reality of the people walking around on the street is 7.4 years, which is basically barely finishing middle school.
That's correct.
How do we interpret a gap of over 8 years between expectation and reality? Doesn't that just mean the expected number is a fantasy?
No, it is not a fantasy at all. It's actually the numerical fingerprint of a generational revolution. What this tells us is that there has been a massive, relatively recent, state-sponsored push in youth education. Think about the demographic reality on the ground. You have an older generation, perhaps someone's grandfather, who grew up in an era where they only received maybe 3 or 4 years of primary schooling. That huge older demographic heavily drags the mean average down to 7.4.
Oh, I see.
Right. But his grandchild entering school today is stepping into a fundamentally different infrastructure. They are expected to go through primary, secondary, and well into tertiary or university education, pushing that expected average up to 15.5.
So it's a country right in the middle of a massive transitional shock. The kids are living in a completely different educational universe than their parents or grandparents.
Exactly. The core drivers of Algeria's baseline development are these two things: a solid baseline of medical care extending life for everyone, and a universally accessible, highly accelerated schooling initiative specifically targeting the youth.
Okay, that makes conceptual sense, but it also raises a massive red flag for me. If you have that much of a generational divide, averages start to become incredibly deceptive.
Oh, absolutely. Averages hide the extremes.
Right. You can have one person in a room with 10 apples and 9 people with 0 apples, and the average still says everyone has an apple. The baseline HDI says Algeria is doing great. But who is actually experiencing this greatness? If I walk down the street in downtown Algiers versus, say, a nomadic community in the deep Sahara, does it look the same?
And this is exactly why the UN developed a secondary metric. The raw HDI is really just the starting point. To answer your question, we have to look at the Inequality-Adjusted Human Development Index, or the IHDI.
The IHDI, right.
This metric takes that impressive 0.763 score and asks a critical question. What happens when we discount this score based on how health education and income are actually distributed across the population.
And the drop here is severe. When we apply that inequality filter, Algeria's score falls from 0.763 down to 0.601. I want you to think of it like a funnel or maybe a bucket with holes in it. You pour the full, beautiful HDI of 0.763 into the top. But as it sits there, 21.2% of that human development just leaks out.
It just disappears.
Yeah, it is lost completely to uneven distribution. Only 0.601 is left for the actual average person to utilize.
A 21.2% loss of human potential is a massive haircut. But again, we have to maintain a global perspective here. Is that objectively bad compared to their peers? The global average loss due to inequality is 22.0%.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So paradoxically, while a 1/5 loss of development is harsh, Algeria is actually slightly more egalitarian in its macroeconomic distribution than the global average.
Okay, I hear that, but I'm sorry, I really don't buy that framing. Calling them an egalitarian success story because they lose slightly less than the global average feels like grading on a massive curve. We need to know exactly where they are bleeding out. We can't just look at the total leakage. We need to do a dimensional analysis. Where are the biggest holes in the bucket?
That is exactly the right question to ask, and the data gives us a very clear, very surprising answer. If we break down that 21.2% overall loss by dimension, we see that income inequality accounts for a 16.8% loss, and life expectancy inequality accounts for an 11.9% loss. So health and wealth are relatively well distributed. But then you look at education. The loss due to education inequality is a staggering 33.3%.
That is wild. Usually when we talk about inequality in any country, our minds immediately go to wealth. We think of billionaires versus minimum wage workers.
Right, the classic economic divide.
But in Algeria, the biggest barrier to true societal potential isn't the distribution of money. It's the deeply uneven distribution of educational resources.
It completely flips our usual assumptions. The state has clearly figured out how to keep people alive evenly, and wealth is distributed fairly moderately compared to, say, hyper-capitalist systems. But the classroom is where the system fractures.
But how does that reconcile with the generational revolution we just talked about? We just established that the expected years of schooling is a world-beating 15.5 years.
Yeah.
You painted a picture of universal access. How can they have such high expectations but such a massive 33.3% inequality loss in that exact same category?
Because that 15.5 years is still an average expectation. A 33.3% loss to inequality means that while a large portion of the youth likely concentrated in urban centers, the coastal cities, the upper middle class, are getting exceptional access to 15 or 16 years of schooling, a significant marginalized portion of the population is being left entirely behind.
So they aren't getting anywhere near that 15 years.
Not even close. They're getting very little, or the quality of what they are getting is drastically lower.
So what does that actually look like on the ground? How does a 33% loss manifest physically in a country?
It suggests severe geographic and socioeconomic barriers. You have to remember, Algeria is the largest country in Africa by landmass,
Right, it's huge.
providing identical, high-quality secondary and tertiary education in the dense coastal capital of Algiers versus the remote, sparsely populated regions of the Sahara is a logistical nightmare.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It implies that while the system technically offers education to everyone, rural populations, nomadic groups, or lower-income families face hidden barriers. Maybe a lack of local high schools, a lack of qualified teachers willing to work in remote areas, or economic pressure to pull teenagers out of school to work. Even with high expected averages nationally, a massive chunk of the population is slipping through the cracks before they ever see the inside of a university.
Okay, so education is the biggest leak in the bucket. The system is failing to distribute knowledge evenly, which naturally begs the question, who exactly is getting the short end of the stick? And this is where the data takes a turn from standard developmental challenges into what I can only describe as a massive structural paradox.
The gender data.
Yes. When we apply a gender lens to this data, everything we think we know about education and economics just breaks down.
To analyze this, the UN uses the Gender Development Index, the GDI. This index measures the gender gap in the exact same 3 dimensions as the HDI: health, knowledge, and living standards. It essentially creates an HDI for women and an HDI for men and compares the ratio.
And Algeria's GDI score is 0.887. Now, the UN categorizes countries into 5 groups based on their absolute deviation from gender parity. Group 1 is the best, meaning men and women are experiencing roughly the same level of human development. Group 5 is the absolute worst.
And Algeria is firmly in Group 5.
Yes, the worst group. It indicates a massive systemic divide. The world average GDI is 0.955. Algeria is lagging significantly behind the global norm. To make it concrete, the female HDI in Algeria is 0.702, while the male HDI is 0.791.
If you look strictly at the raw index, this gender divide is undeniably the Achilles heel of Algeria's societal development. It is the primary anchor weighing down their overall progress.
Absolutely.
But to truly understand the bizarre, almost illogical nature of this gap, we have to look at how it breaks down internally. We have to look at the tension between what women are learning and what they're earning.
I was staring at the specific data point for an hour yesterday because it almost looks like a clerical error in the spreadsheet.
It really does.
I want you to think of an architectural blueprint that has been drawn completely upside down. On the top half of the blueprint, we have education. We've talked about the high average, but let's split it by gender. Women in Algeria actually have more expected years of schooling than men.
Significantly more. The data shows 16.2 expected years for females compared to 14.8 expected years for males.
Right, so the women are staying in school longer, they are outperforming men in educational attainment, they are likely achieving higher tertiary degrees. By all data-driven definitions, they are a highly prepared demographic.
Yes, extremely prepared.
Now look at the bottom half of the blueprint, the economy, specifically the estimated gross national income per capita. Despite having an extra year and a half of advanced education, the female GNI per capita is only $5,284.
Which is startlingly low.
And the male GNI per capita is a massive $24,554. The structure makes absolutely zero sense.
It is an almost 5-to-1 income disparity running in the exact opposite direction of the educational advantage. This is the definition of a structural bottleneck.
It's as if the society is paying immense amounts of money and time to train marathon runners for 16 years. They give them the best shoes, the best coaching, the best nutrition, and then on the day of the race, they lock the stadium doors, turn off the lights, and just don't let them run. It defies basic economic logic. Why is a nation building incredible human capital if they have no intention of utilizing it?
To understand the mechanics of how this happens, we have to look at the Gender Inequality Index, or the GII. While the GDI measures the achievement gap we just talked about, the GII measures the loss of potential due to inequality in reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market. Algeria's current GII is 0.443.
Wait, hold on. You're throwing a lot of UN acronyms at me, and they are starting to contradict each other.
It's dense.
How can they be in the absolute worst Group 5 for the Gender Development Index, but their Gender Inequality Index of 0.443 is actually slightly better than the world average of 0.443? That feels completely backwards.
I know it sounds counterintuitive, but it's because of what the GII specifically prioritizes. It heavily factors in maternal health and basic physical well-being. If we look at the historical timeline, this metric explains a lot. In 1995, Algeria's GII was a very poor 0.673.
Okay.
Over 30 years, there have been vast, undeniable improvements. For example, maternal deaths dropped from over 200 per 100,000 live births in 1990 down to roughly 77 today.
Oh.
Adolescent birth rates plummeted.
Okay, so the state put a massive, successful effort into basic biological survival for women.
Exactly. My synthesis of this data is this. The physical health, the basic survival, and the educational access for women have largely been solved by the state infrastructure. They have built the hospitals to keep women healthy, and they have built the universities to get them highly educated. But the translation of those health and educational gains into societal power, economic independence, and labor integration is hitting a brick wall. The state can guarantee a woman a university degree, but the society and the economy are failing to guarantee her a desk to sit at when she graduates.
And that brick wall is what I want to deeply examine right now, because we've seen the economic gap on paper, the $5,000 versus the $24,000. But numbers on a page can be abstract. I want to look at the actual bodies in the workforce and the seats in the halls of power to see exactly how this imbalance plays out in daily life. Because I am about to drop what I think is the heaviest, most shocking statistic of this entire deep dive.
Go ahead, lay it out.
The female labor force participation rate in Algeria is exactly 17.61%. Let me repeat that for you because it takes a second to really process. 17.61%. To give you context, the global average for female labor participation hovers around 47.5%.
This is the operational reality of that log stadium analogy you used earlier. This is what the 5-to-1 income disparity looks like on the street level.
If you were to look at 100 highly educated, healthy, working-age Algerian women, only 17 of them are participating in the formal workforce.
Only 17.
The other 82 are economically invisible.
The macroeconomic damage this causes is almost difficult to quantify. What this data tells us is that over 82% of working-age women are outside the formal labor market. And remember, we aren't talking about a population of uneducated laborers. We're talking about a demographic with 16.2 expected years of schooling.
They have degrees.
Yes, this is a catastrophic level of unutilized human capital and lost productivity. From a purely objective economic standpoint, a nation simply cannot maximize its GDP or its human development potential while benching half of its most educated players.
So, mechanically, how does this actually happen? How does a woman spend 16 years in school, excel, graduate, and then end up at home? Are there literal laws preventing them from working?
No, it's rarely a matter of overt legal prohibition in nations at this stage of development. It is a complex web of structural and economic realities. First, you have to look at the nature of the Algerian economy itself.
Okay, what drives it?
It is heavily reliant on hydrocarbons, oil, and gas. These industries traditionally skew heavily male in their workforce globally, which drives up that male GNI we talked about.
Right. If all the money is in oil rigs and refineries, and those are culturally male-dominated spaces, the wealth naturally concentrates there.
Precisely. Secondly, outside of the state sector, the private sector in Algeria has historically struggled to create enough diverse, high-skilled jobs to absorb this massive influx of university graduates, regardless of gender. There's a bottleneck of jobs.
Okay.
But when jobs are scarce, traditional societal norms often dictate that men, as the presumed primary breadwinners, are prioritized for employment. And to that, a lack of robust childcare infrastructure, which makes balancing a career and family incredibly difficult, and you end up with 82% of women pushed out of the formal economy.
Okay, so the economic doors are closed. What about the political doors? You would naturally assume that as a demographic gets more educated, as they absolutely dominate the tertiary education metrics, they would demand and achieve rising political power to force those economic doors open.
You would think so.
But the data shows something completely different. We need to talk about the parliament paradox.
This is a fascinating and somewhat alarming trend line in the dataset. If we look at the share of seats in parliament held by women, we see a distinct peak in the recent past. In 2016, female representation in the Algerian parliament hit a high of 25.8%.
Over a quarter of the legislative body was female? That sounds like real progress. That tracks with the rising education level.
The Dutch.
But then you trace the data to the present day. By 2023, that number had violently dropped to just 6.8%. Or, looking strictly at the spreadsheet, 6.759%. Let me ask you, how does a demographic get more educated, healthier, and more capable, yet suddenly lose 75% of its political representation in less than a decade? Did they just stop running for office?
As analysts looking purely at the mechanics of the data and maintaining strict political neutrality here, we have to frame this objectively. What this highlights is a deep paradox where social indicators, like health and education, are entirely decoupling from political and economic indicators.
Decoupling, meaning one doesn't cause the other anymore.
Exactly. We used to assume that if you educate a population, political power naturally follows. It was thought to be a linear progression. This data proves that increasing human capital does not automatically dismantle systemic, structural, or cultural barriers to entry.
So what happened between 2016 and 2023?
The spike in 2016 was largely driven by specific quota systems implemented to boost female representation. When the application or enforcement of those quotas shifted or weakened in subsequent electoral cycles, the numbers crashed.
So without a legally enforced mechanism holding the door open, it just slammed shut again, regardless of how many degrees the women held.
Yes. It shows us that without specific, sustaining policy frameworks, educational gains do not organically translate into legislative power or economic integration. The data is telling us that the system allows and even encourages women to prepare for power, but is highly resistant to them actually wielding it.
It is a stunning display of unfulfilled potential. But, as we promised in the intro, this deep dive is a story of whiplash-inducing contradictions. We have spent the last half hour looking at massive educational gaps, locked economic doors, and crashing political representation.
It paints a tough picture.
It does. But what happens when we take all of this data, the high HDI, the low female labor participation, the hydrocarbon economy, and view it through an entirely different lens? What happens when we look through the planetary lens? Because this is where the story flips upside down again. Let's talk about Algeria's status as a low-carbon pioneer.
This takes us right back to the central paradox we opened the show with,
Oh.
the massive leap in the rankings. We use a metric called the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, or the PHDI.
Our giant green arrow. Algeria leaps from rank 101 on the Standard Index all the way to rank 63 on the Planetary Index, a 38-spot jump. So mechanically, how are they doing this? What is the mathematical logic here?
The core logic of the PHDI is to penalize countries for the environmental damage they cause while achieving their standard of living.
Right.
For decades, the global north, the West, achieved very high HDI scores. They got the long life expectancies and the great schools.
But they did it dirty.
Exactly. They did it through intense carbon dependency, massive resource extraction, and high pollution. The PHDI levels the playing field. It asks, how efficiently are you turning planetary resources into human development? Algeria has managed to reach a high human development category with that 76-year life expectancy and 15-year education expectancy without forcing the planet to pick up the tab.
Let's weigh the specific footprints to see exactly how light they are treading. We have carbon emissions and material footprint. In 2023, Algeria produced 3.91 tons of carbon dioxide per capita.
Okay.
The world average is 4.54 tons, so they're notably lighter on carbon. But the real shocker is the material footprint. This metric measures the raw materials, biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, and non-metallic minerals extracted to meet the final consumption demands of the country.
Basically, how much physical earth are you digging up to live your life?
Exactly. Algeria consumes 8.8 tons per capita. The world average is a massive, heavy 12.71 tons per capita.
Their material footprint is astonishingly low for a country with their life expectancy and educational infrastructure. They are consuming way less physical stuff than their global peers to maintain their standard of living.
But this raises a massive question. A cynical question, maybe, but we have to ask it. We need to synthesize all the data we've discussed so far. Is this incredible sustainability due to intentional, visionary green policies? Or is it a byproduct of an under-industrialized economy?
I see exactly where you're going with this.
If we link this low footprint back to the missing 82% of the female workforce, think about it mechanically. If a country has an economy where essentially only half the adult population is formally participating in industrial and corporate labor, your carbon emissions and material footprint are naturally going to be lower.
It's a very compelling hypothesis based purely on the numbers. Think about the daily reality. There are millions of fewer people commuting every day. There are fewer factories running at maximum capacity because they aren't employing a dual-gender workforce.
Right.
There is drastically less disposable income circulating in the economy, which naturally suppresses the hyperconsumption that drives up material footprints in the West.
Exactly. The data forces us to ask, is Algeria's green status a triumph of ecological management, or is it an accidental premium earned by locking half of its economic potential at home? Are they green by design, or are they green by default?
It is the defining tension of their entire development model. And it's a tension that many developing nations face right now.
Yeah.
Is your low carbon footprint a sign of innovation or just a symptom of suppressed economic activity? The reality is likely a mix of both, but the correlation between a locked workforce and low material consumption simply cannot be ignored.
Okay, we've looked at the massive averages. We've looked at the green footprints. We've analyzed the severe gender divide. But what about the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder? We talked earlier about the 33.3% loss due to inequality. How do the absolute most vulnerable fare in this system? I want to look at the hidden edges of this society through the multidimensional poverty index.
The UN measures this using the MPI. This is a critical metric because it doesn't just look at income. A standard poverty line of, say, $2 a day doesn't tell you much about how someone is actually living.
Right, because $2 goes further in some places than others?
Exactly. The MPI looks at severe overlapping deprivations in health, education, and living standards at the household level. It identifies who is truly absolutely destitute, who lacks a dirt floor, clean water, and basic schooling all at the exact same time.
And when you look at Algeria's MPI reality check, the overall value is tiny. It's 0.005. To put that in human terms, only 1.4% of the population lives in multidimensional poverty.
Which is remarkably low.
Right. Earning a living may be tough, the economy might be skewed heavily toward men, but absolute systemic destitution is incredibly rare.
It is a massive success story. A 1.4% headcount for multidimensional poverty is something many, many nations strive for. It reinforces the strength of that baseline we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive. The state has built a robust floor that prevents almost everyone from falling into absolute ruin.
But even within that tiny 1.4%, there is a specific structure to their poverty. I want to break down the causes of that remaining destitution. Imagine the total poverty as a single pie. What makes up the slices? Standard of living deprivations, things like a lack of cooking fuel, poor sanitation, or no electricity, contribute 19.4% to the poverty index. Health deprivations, primarily child mortality and severe malnutrition, contribute 31.2%. But what is the dominant cause? What is the biggest slice of the pie?
It's education.
It's education. A lack of education contributes a massive 49.3% to the multidimensional poverty index.
And this is where the data becomes beautifully, tragically consistent. Let's connect this all the way back to the inequality filter we applied earlier. Remember the leaky bucket?
Yeah, the 21.2% total loss.
Right. And within that, we noted that there was a 33.3% loss to the inequality-adjusted HDI purely due to education inequality. The system was failing to distribute knowledge evenly. And now, when we look at the absolute lowest rung of society, that highly marginalized 1.4% living in poverty, we see that a lack of education is the primary driver of their destitution, causing nearly half of their deprivation.
The data is screaming the exact same message from two completely different angles.
It really is. Education is the ultimate bottleneck for equality in Algeria. Even though the average expected schooling is world-class at 15.5 years, the failure to deliver it evenly to the rural margins is the root cause of both their national inequality loss and the remaining extreme poverty. If you don't get access to that educational revolution we talked about, you fall completely off the map.
So what does this all mean? We've traveled through a mountain of data today. We've gone from planetary premiums to parliament crashes. Let's synthesize this. We've seen that Algeria is a country of extreme, almost contradictory realities. They are an overperformer for the planet. They guarantee long life and massive schooling averages for their youth. But they are a severe underperformer for women's economic integration, and they struggle to distribute their educational wealth equally, leaving a small but distinct group behind in poverty.
As an analyst, looking purely at the mechanics of this data set, it provides a very clear three-step strategic roadmap for the future. The data essentially writes its own policy recommendations.
Okay, let's hear the roadmap. Step 1.
Step 1. They must activate their female labor force. They possess a world-leading educational reserve in their women with 16.2 years of expected schooling. Policy frameworks, private sector incentives, and childcare and infrastructure must be designed to turn this massive education dividend into a tangible economic benefit.
Right. You've spent 16 years training the marathon runners. Unlock the stadium doors and let them run.
Exactly. Step 2. Bridge the education gap. Solving that 33.3% inequality loss in schooling is the skeleton key for this country. It is the only way to lift the overall inequality-adjusted HDI, and it is the exact mechanism needed to cure the remaining 1.4% of the population living in absolute multidimensional poverty. They need to figure out how to get the same quality of education found in Algiers into the deepest parts of the Sahara.
And step 3.
Maintain the green advantage. They have a 38-rank premium on the planetary index. As they industrialize, and as they hopefully integrate their massive female workforce, they must leverage that baseline sustainability. They need to build high-value, low-carbon industries rather than following the dirty, heavily polluting industrialization paths of the 20th century West. My vision, based entirely on the math in front of us, if Algeria bridges its gender gap and fixes its educational distribution, they have the latent human capital to easily break into the global top 70 standard HDI countries without sacrificing their planet.
It's an incredible blueprint hidden in plain sight within the numbers. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. It ties right back to our opening hook about the green arrows and the paradoxes. We've established that 82% of highly educated Algerian women are currently outside the formal workforce. But what happens to that beautifully low carbon footprint, that world-beating 3.9 tons per capita, if and when millions of women finally enter the industrialized economy?
That is the ultimate tension of the 21st century. Can a country double its active workforce, double its commuters, double its industrial output without doubling its planetary pressure?
Or, to look at the darker side of the coin, is Algeria's esteemed green status quietly dependent on keeping half of its population at home? Can they afford to be egalitarian without cooking the earth? That is a question the data aggressively asks, but only the future can answer.
Remember, data isn't just a dusty record of what happened in the past. It's a map to the future. It shows us exactly where the roadblocks are and exactly where the massive untapped potential lies.
Beautifully said. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the numbers. We hope it gave you a new perspective on how development, equality, and the environment are all tangled up together. Until next time, keep looking deeper.